Hello, everyone. Welcome. This is the 387th meeting of the New York Comics and Picture-story Symposium. My name is Phil Cardelopoulos. I, along with Austin English, Lily Carre, work with Ben Ketchor, who founded the symposium, to curate what has become a kind of a weekly speaker series dealing with comics, visual narrative, and other text-image phenomena. The New York Comics and Picture-story Symposium originally started as a kind of outgrowth of Occupy Wall Street. There was a kind of concept in the air at the time to create a sort of Occupy University, in other words, to take education outside of the kind of ivory tower of academia and make it sort of public and free as much as possible. So Ben Ketchor started this symposium, and as I said, what it's become over the years is a weekly speaker series where we hear often from artists, but also from scholars and other people involved with these topics. This week, I'm personally honored to be hosting a presentation by artist Lee Mars. I'll read Lee Mars's bio first. Lee Mars is best known for the further fattening adventures of Pudge, Girl Blimp. Lee Mars was a frequent contributor to Underground Comics and one of the founding mommies of the Women's Comics Collective, as well as Gay Comics. In 1982, she received the Inkpot Award, and in 2022, CXC, Cartoon Crossroad Columbus, gave her the Transformative Work Award for changing the course of comics and cartooning history. Using a more illustrative style, Lee created short futuristic graphic tales for Heavy Metal Magazine and Epic Illustrated. After assisting on Prince Valiant, Lil Orphan Annie, and other comic strips, she drew tales for DC's Plop, Weird Mystery, and House of Secrets, but most of her mainstream comics work was as a writer for Unicorn Isle, Wonder Woman, Viking Glory, Zatanna, Faultlines, and Batman Legends of the Dark Knight. But for most of her career, Lee ran Lee Mars Artwork, a digital design and animation company. An Emmy award-winning art director, she pioneered in 2D digital animation in the early 80s and has worked for clients including Disney, ABC, Apple Computer, IBM, Time Warner, Children's Television Workshop, Nickelodeon, Electronic Arts, and MTV. Beginning in 2000, Mars taught at Berkeley City College. She served as multimedia chair there until she retired in 2014. Glad to have spent some time out of the cold, as she writes. And certainly teaching can be a really helpful stabilizer for independent creative professionals. I say, speaking from the faculty lounge of the new school where I'm teaching. Before we get into it, I just want to say I'm really pleased that Lee Mars is here today. I've actually never heard Lee speak, but I think, especially, I feel like there's been a kind of rediscovery maybe, or maybe reevaluation of some work from Underground Comics, after years of intense focus on like the Zap crew and some of the other artists from that period. And that has certainly included a lot of women who are making comics during the Underground period. We've seen in recent years really nice hardcover anthology collections of women's comics and more recently Tits and Clits, and nice books of works by people that like Diane Newman and Aileen Kaminsky Crumb. And I think Lee Mars is someone who's the equal of any other artist of that period you might think of at the very least. And in particular, Lee's series, the Adventures of Pudge, Girl Blimp, to me seems so prescient. It's a narrative. Well, first of all, it's a narrative. And that's not necessarily typical of all the underground comics, you know. And I don't just mean that it's a coherent story, but the three issues of Pudge Girl Blimp really have an arc to them. Like it really anticipates the long form storytelling, I think, of the graphic novel in a way that was not common among the underground comics artists. On top of that, of course, it deals with a lot of issues, including, I think, something that's very much more commonly discussed now, which is body image. You know, it's a tale of a character who, you know, is, you know, considered by others to be, you know, overweight, I guess, or, you know, heavier than is considered ideal by the standards of American culture, by beauty culture, etc. You know, and in a way, it's also a kind of like a story of someone trying to kind of enter the hippie scene and live a liberated life, you know, and going through a lot trying to actually get there beyond just making the gestures and, you know, and, you know, putting themselves in the spaces where this, you know, supposedly liberated, free thinking, free loving, sexually free kind of lifestyle is happening. So there's, I mean, and there's more that I could say about that. I will add too, that in a way, this is kind of a, the tonight's session, I was inspired to reach out to Lee by a previous symposium session. We had a scholar named Margaret Galvin who gave a talk in the last season about her book Invisible Archives, and she focused her presentation very specifically on her chapter of that book, which is about underground comics, focusing on Lee Mars and Roberta Gregory as two artists whose work is not just part of the archive of feminist culture, but in a way functions as an archive by telling us a lot about what people were doing and thinking at that time. So nobody's here to hear from me. I hope I haven't gone on too long in introduction. Without any further ado, please allow me to introduce artist Lee Mars. Thanks for being here, Lee. Do you want to share your screen?
Yep.
Perfect.
Hello and happy vernal equinox. The first advice as to how you can succeed in the art world, and this is guaranteed, foolproof, is to have someone who owes parents for letting them, whether it's comic books, movies, animated films, or games. This is the quickest and the surest way to succeed. I drew comics as a little kid. I got my inspiration from comic strips and comic books, but I never thought that I would do them professionally. I also wrote short stories and several ghastly poems. I had lots of opinions. So I decided I was going to be an editorial cartoonist. But along the way, I did every kind of art job, starting in high school doing Chevrolet window art for the holidays, like George Washington's birthday. Every school I attended, I did cartoons for the school newspaper. These are some from my freshman year in college. It concerns current affairs and the college. So during my sophomore year at American University in Washington, D.C., my editor showed my work to Herb Block, the Pulitzer Prize-winning editorial cartoonist for the Washington Post. He said, "Hey, this guy is good. When he graduates, tell him to see me." At AU, I met my lifelong best friend, Barb Blaisdell. Her dad, Tex Blaisdell, was the background artist for the comic strips Lil Orphan Annie, Prince Valiant, Hi Lois, etc. He quickly realized I was very talented. This was a revelation to him because he was of the World War II generation of male artists who thought no girls could really draw. So during college, I assisted him. I would go up to New York City for the weekend and then return Monday morning. I started filling in the blacks on Prince Valiant. Eventually, I graduated to inking chain mail. And if you're familiar with Prince Valiant's style, you know I had a hand cramp for the rest of the week. I realized that the business end of comics was reprehensible, so I never pursued it as a career. You got paid by the completed page on a 30-day basis. You didn't get any royalties. You didn't own the work, and the deadlines were killer. Tex worked 24/7, never got a day off. Why would anyone work like that? So when I graduated, I went to see Herb Block, who was amazed that I was a girl. He told me there were no female editorial cartoonists in the United States, only maybe a few in Europe. He did give me recommendation letters to a dozen newspapers, but I received no answers back from them or only a polite rejection. Not wanting to move to Europe, I abandoned that lifelong dream. At the time in the newspapers, there were classified ads for women and classified ads for men. So for 5 months, I got the cold shoulder. "We don't hire girls. We run a rough shop here, and the men curse constantly." This was from Aviation Week magazine. Rough shop? This actually was, as you may have guessed, sexism, although at the time there wasn't a word for it. Find out specifically, this is the next point. Try to find specifically why you didn't get the job. Not to be embarrassed, but to learn what to do for the next interview or what to work on to improve. This may take some post-interview emailing, but it will help you to proceed. Motivated by the necessity to eat, I began to use my ambisexual name and finally I got her from WTOP TV, the CBS DC. I went in with my portfolio and the just named art director said, "But you're a woman." I was quite encouraged. I had gone from girl to woman. This was a graphic artist job for WTOP. They were down one artist and desperately faced the election year 1968 with tons of graphics needed. I could do all the art jobs necessary: graphic design, illustration, portraits, cartoons. So the brave new art director cigar, Jack Jury was, he knew that this work in Boyo was actually mine. Somebody
Lee, can you hear me? Your audio is breaking up a little bit. Can you hear me?
Then I became art director of their documentary unit. We not only covered the election, but the Washington, D.C. riots after Be flexible. Whatever your dream is, keep your mind. You never have any idea where one particular kind of work may lead you. My personal life collapsed, and I looked in the broadcasting news magazine for another job. I needed to leave town. There were graphic artist positions in New Orleans and San Francisco, so I applied to both and eventually got both. The two offered individually wonderful possibilities. I couldn't decide which one. So I finally flipped a coin. It came up heads. So I took off for San Francisco. I worked at KPIX for 5 whole weeks. Then they had a business reversal and laid people off. Last hired, first fired. But by this time, I had fallen in love with San Francisco. Now I began a series of part-time jobs that usually precede people's actual careers. I was a door-to-door marketing salesperson, a fitting room boarding school and the women's fur department by a kind employment agency employee who called late one Friday night to tell me that his boyfriend had quit his job that day. It was a display artist job at Macy's of California. He said that they wouldn't post the job until late next week. So if I went into their HR department on Monday, I might get the job. I flooded him with thanks. Next morning, Saturday, I went to the San Francisco library to find out what a display artist was. The description involved window design and other mysterious things. I had designed sets for WTOP. Maybe this could work. I spent the entire weekend redoing my portfolio. Monday, I went in and got the job. Next bit of advice. Judicious lying can help. The operating word here is judicious. Good judgment and sense. Not blatant, not over the top. Don't it makes on which he was working. They needed an art director who was willing to work for free. So on weekends, because I was terribly bored, I joined the circus that was Francis Ford Coppola's American Zoetrope Studios. I designed the newspaper ads for George Lucas's THX 1138. I art directed the documentary about the Native American takeover of Alcatraz called Where Have All the Buffalo Gone?, which flunks as a title, and so on. I worked there for several weeks on weekends. Coppola was never good with scheduling or money. Seven Arts, who owned Coppola's ass at the time, pulled the plug entirely and shut down Zoetrope. But his canny assistant arranged for us all to receive unemployment insurance payments. The amount was only a little less than what I was getting from Macy's, so I quit. On weekends, I began selling black and white collage collage drawings on Telegraph Avenue in Berkeley. I'd never just messed around with art. Do stuff for no particular reason, just try different techniques. Eventually, I exhibited at several galleries, a few of them, all of which closed within a month of my shows. Could this be a message? Nevertheless, I did meet an internationally known designer, Laurel Birch, who was selling beside me on Telegraph Avenue at the time. Next bit of advice. Whatever your actual job, keep practicing your art. If you're writing, keep up your skills and improving. Join a group. Feedback is important. If you're an artist, the same applies. There are always new software and upgrades to old software that you have to master. You never know what you might create. I ran out of money and went job hunting again. With as their retirement party cartoonist. Yes, Standard Oil had been around for over 100 years. So every month they had several executives retiring. So I would call up their families, ask them all kinds of questions about their hubby/dad. They would send me copies of his photographs over the years, and I would either do up a slideshow of hopefully hilarious images from his personal life, from his professional life, or I would do a large cartoon of him with little images surrounding him and a blank strip at the bottom where all his coworkers could sign, probably totally relieved that the old guy was going at last. Next bit of advice. Whatever your project, the basis is a story. Your ability to succeed depends on the quality of the questions you ask. The answers to those questions determine the story. What's the underlying project? What's the point of this? Simultaneously, I kept setting on Telegraph Avenue on weekends. At a print shop, I arranged to have some of my drawings printed up. While my drawings were in the shop, a fellow came in to have some business cards done. He said he needed an artist. So they showed him my drawings and he called me. He and a partner were stationery done up. We three met, and it turned out I knew more than they did about printing, publishing, deadlines, etc. So we three became partners in alternative feature service, providing feature stories, illustrations, and cartoons for college newspapers, underground newspapers, and a few regular papers like the LA Times. I worked at Standard Oil during the week and subverted the power structure on weekends. Eventually, I quit Standard Oil and moved to Berkeley. But as usual with my enthusiasms, there was no money in alternative feature service. We had no way of collecting from our subscribers if they didn't pay. Although I did have a brother who volunteered to face off people in Chicago who weren't paying, but that never developed. Around the corner from alternative feature service was Telegraph Avenue. And in the head shops, I discovered underground comics. Now, I had never, ever seen anything like this. What a revelation. These were great. They were a little crude, but the subject matter was hilarious and hip. I'd never seen anything like it before. Here were books untrammeled by any of the constraints of mainstream comics. Wow, you could create anything you wanted, keep the copyright, and keep a good amount of the money. Well, it turns out there was almost no money in underground comics, but it took us a little while to realize that. The next bit of advice: if you see an opportunity, seize it. Don't wait for certainties. There actually aren't any. Your work life is what you make it. I went around to all the underground publishers in the Bay Area and learned that underground comics were created by different bunches of male friends. And unlike the mainstream comics, there were no editors. I had no entree into the male groups. I had drawn the first story of the further fattening adventures of Pudge girl Blimp and taken it to Ron Turner at Last Gasp Echo Funnies, proposing an entire book of her stories. Turner liked my work, said he would publish it, and also said that Pat Moodian, an employee of his, was gathering a group of women to put together a woman's comic. So I went and became a founding mommy of women's comics. We met about every other week for years and years and years. And this group was a wonderful gang. When we first started out, we were discussing back and forth what we were going to call this women's comic. And then finally we said, women's comics. Hey, what an idea. Okay. So for quite a few years, the Women's Comics Collected formed my tribe. I found my voice. I wrote and drew endless stories and covers for various issues, fundraising books, and not-for-profit causes. So the women's comics was because of what we had encountered with comics in general, and most especially the men's underground comics, half of each issue was devoted to new people. We originally had submissions from across the states, and then eventually internationally as well. This meant, and this was a conscious decision, this meant that the book would never get really good. It wouldn't be a wonderful looking book ever, but it made for an amazing variety of work and was the first chance quite a few women had to see their work in print. Because it was and that was really hard to manage. A lot of the women were good artists, but they couldn't manage a story to save their lives. Or perhaps the story was excellent, but the drawing was almost incomprehensible. So whoever was the editor and whoever she could drag to help her became an instructor as well as an editor. That was kind of rewarding, I think. During all this time, I wanted to talk about my favorite women's comic story. This Moonshine Mama was based on a friend of my grandmother. My grandmother went around as a good Christian woman, delivering food to her friends who were now bedridden or were locked in their homes. And there are other stories about that. But one of her friends had been a moonshiner as a young woman. And so I remembered these stories and put them together as Moonshine Mama. It got into the unions. It got into coal mining and the wretchedness that resulted in people having lung fever, et cetera, et cetera. And it was a tribute to my grandma. The women's comics people branched out into several other issues. One was Wet Satin, women's erotic fantasies. These were nitty-gritty fantasies. Dennis Kitchen approached me wanting me to do a comic of my own. I was already doing Pudge Girl Blimp by this time for Mike Friedrich's Star Reach Productions, but he thought there was a market for it. So I came up with The Complete Fart and Other Body Emissions. Dennis was sad that this couldn't be a scratch and sniff magazine, but it did pretty well. I also worked with gay comics. Howard Cruz edited gay comics. He sent around a letter to everybody, and he called up and asked me particularly because he wanted to have women as well as men in the book. I'm bisexual, so I qualified for stories. I was issues, and this started a following among gay people that I've enjoyed ever since. There were really funny stories, and I could write as long as I wanted. Being a blabbermouth, I appreciated it. A lot of the stories were parodies of straight stories. So this was a Gothic tale of real estate and romance. At the same time, I was freelancing in the mainstreams. I went to New York a couple of times a year looking for magazine illustration work, and I got a little bit of that from High Times and book cover work. I never managed that. So Tex had introduced me to Joe Orlando, the editor at DC Comics, who gave me stories for Plop and House of Mystery. That began my career in mainstream comics for both DC and later Marvel. I was one of the first creators to live outside DC. I worked for DC doing mainly writing and Marvel doing mostly drawing while I did underground comics at the same time. The mainstream was good because you could do stories for characters you'd love since you were a kid. The stories had great distribution and they paid good money. The undergrounds were good because you could express yourself freely, period. They had rotten distribution and paid a dinky, itsy-bitsy amount of money. The exception to this was Star Reach Productions. Mike Friedrich allowed complete artistic freedom, paid good money, and so I did a lot of stories for him. Using a straight illustration style, my favorite was the series Stark's Quest. Mike became my agent and got my work into heavy metal and epic illustrated. I could have created comics for the rest of my life. That would have been it, but there was never enough work. This went into heavy metal. The next bit of advice: find a niche and fill it. If there's a corner of activity and you can work it, do. Particularly if it's a profitable niche. Become the expert in that area. Folks will flock to you. I always had to support my comics addiction with other work. For 30 years, I ran Lee Marr's artwork. an art and animation company. Back when I was WTOP TV, they decided to use animation to highlight their fall lineup. I created the storyboards for that and had been the liaison between the station and the animation company. I became fascinated with moving pictures. Out in California, I took night classes at the San Francisco Museum of Art. The instructor was impressed with my drawing ability, and for a short while we were partners. But he turned out to be someone who only worked when he was in the mood. So we parted company. With Limar's artwork, I worked on commercials, public service announcements, educational films, and movies. This was way back in the 70s when there was only traditional animation. So actually, I made my one and only good professional guess about the future. It was in computers. I had seen the NASA animations about going to the moon and suddenly thought that's the future of animations. So in 1979, I audited a couple of classes at UC Berkeley on computer graphics. I thought I would have to move to New York or Utah, where preliminary computer graphics were being developed at the time. But Aurora Systems, an early producer of digital animation hardware and software, popped up in San Francisco. Using my previous clients, I tried out their system and became their resident animator for the next 5 years. It was wonderful working with the software engineers to develop the system's animation capabilities. It activated my brain as no other media had. The next bit of advice: always find some backup to tide you over. It may be boring or tedious, perhaps nothing you would want on your resume, but you need a reliable source of support. As always, no particular work was enough to, by now, pay the mortgage. So I taught at different schools part-time. Storyboarding, shown here, different animation software, advanced, etc. I created the animation strand at Berkeley City College. This was welcome drabs of regular income. The next bit of advice: it's best if you had one skill that can be used in different ways. It can be your organizing ability, or your speedy script altering skill, or your unerring color sense. Whatever can be utilized in varying circumstances. The way I got into all of these different media was storyboarding. Reading scripts and then coming up with the images was great fun. It was sort of like comics. For movie work, I was often assigned to beginning directors. In those cases, it was a matter of the visual part of animating being presented to folks who usually only read scripts. These were different movies that I storyboarded. This also got me into games. Electronic Arts Experimental Department hired me to storyboard a possible game. It took months. What a nightmare. The drawings finally formed a length that went entirely around my backyard fence. I have photos. So then a former student of mine called me saying that a game software company where he worked needed an entire game storyboarded. Massive job. After I finished that, the company asked me to become their studio art chief. representing the artists on all their games. At the time, part-time. Purple Moon Media, a girls' game company, wanted an animation director for a game. All these projects were great, very entertaining, but games companies are notoriously fragile, and all of them failed. I continued doing illustrations throughout. This was a Solzhenitsyn portrait that I did for Amnesty International's box newsletter. I worked on movies not just as a storyboard, but as an artist as well. This is about the best of the movies I worked on. The others were things like Escape from Gator Glades. But this one was really cool. I recommend it. For the state of California, I did animations having to do with farm workers becoming ill from poisons in the fields. And this one was a historical series about the Vikings. In the year 2000, I was really tired. Constantly changing software had defeated me. The mainstream comics world had editors not born when I had started out. So I turned to full-time teaching. Whoa, you need a graduate degree to teach at an accredited college? Damn. Fortunately, just miles away was a multimedia graduate degree. So at age 60, I went back to school. Next bit of advice. If you know more than your instructors, after I graduated with many applications to many schools, I got a full-time teaching position at Berkeley City College and became briefly co-chair and then chair of the multimedia department, teaching every one of the media I'd worked in myself over the years. Retiring in 2014, I slept late for a few years. Then I put the 3 issues of Pudge Girl Blimp together and added her subsequent appearances elsewhere into one volume. With a blurb by Alison Bechtel and a foreword by Gloria Steinem, the book sells out at every gathering of comics fans, just so long as I'm there to beat them over the head. Last bit of advice. The internet has changed life in the arts forever. Aspiring folks can put up their portfolios, sample comics pages, samples of writing, anything on the web. They have perfect freedom to post anything they desire and an opportunity to be discovered and get paid. Amazing. So I'll briefly go into, because I've been asked by a lot of people, how I do my work. I start from chaos, just a little idea or something, and then add to it over how much time it takes. The thing on the left is a page where I gathered sketches and stuff to a animated series, Sink, Tub, and Toilet, that was going to be on Oxygen Media, one of the first streaming services. But Oxygen got bought out by somebody, and they went in, quote, a different direction, unquote. Nevertheless, that's how things start. On the right is a setup involving Post-its. I think Post-its are the greatest invention in the world because you can change your mind. You can set up things and then change your mind by just replacing some squares with other squares. It's wonderful. So the yellow is the main plot. The green is an alternative to the main plot. And the pink is another version. So I especially use this in games, in working on games. This is how I set up the larger work I've done. This is an issue of Faultlines, a series that I wrote for Vertigo, one of DC Comics ventures. And in each Post-it, there are the images that are going to appear on that page. And then once I've done that page, I cross it out. Never with black, because then you couldn't see what you had done. But this way, I can keep track of where the hell I am and where I'm going. You remember that I started out wanting to be an editorial cartoonist. So every year, I put out a New Year's card. This one was back in 2014 when Obamacare was all the rage. We had new kittens in the house, and an old cat who was supposed to die within a couple of months, but with the new cats in the house, she stuck around for the next 6 years. This was, again, when the oppressive evaluation of people first started. All of the comments are direct quotes from crowds that I had been in. And sometimes it's art pieces. This started out as a pencil drawing that I scanned in and reversed, and then added just about everything I could think of. So that's it.
Thank you so much, Lee. That's so wonderful. You know, I turned off the video broadcasting when you were presenting because your sound was cutting out just a little bit, and sometimes that helps. Do you want to go? Oh, great. You just started your video again. Perfect. Thank you so much for that. That was a really exceptional presentation. You know, I mean, you've done so much. It's really incredible to see the whole breadth of your career in one presentation. And it's funny to me, too, that you even had a hand in those newspaper comic strips. A few weeks ago, I don't know if you ever met Paul Kirchner, who also did some stuff for heavy metal. He did a strip called The Bus and
Right.
Dope Rider for High Times magazine. And he did the symposium a few weeks ago. And I also had no idea that he had started out as, I think he was an assistant to Leonard Starr when Leonard Starr took over the Annie comic strip. So it's so funny that like so many people kind of got their like training wheels, you know, like assisting on these like long-lived comic strips that are some of which are still going today, like more than 100 years after they first got started. But even more, I mean, you're just the breadth of your career is so incredible, and you're clearly so adaptable. I mean, incorporating computer stuff and doing game design and things like that. It's all very, very impressive. I could ask a few questions, but right now I just want to ask, does anybody in our audience have a question for Lee? If you like, you can either raise a virtual hand under reactions on Zoom. You can raise a hand, or if you want to type something in the chat. I could certainly pick up a question there. But going back to some of the stuff that you were talking about earlier, one thing I wanted to ask too is how, I mean, because your talk itself, you know, I teach, and your talk itself is almost like structured like a series of lessons. And how, if you could talk a little bit about how you sort of got, if you could maybe go into a little more detail about how you got involved with teaching, but also if it was something, I'm just curious to know if it was something you felt came naturally to you, or if there were any things that you had to learn about making things clear and understandable to students.
Well, I've always been a bossy person. So there was no question as far as who was going to be in charge of the class. Most all the classes were based on what I had run into practically myself. So breaking things apart in order for people to understand each part before they tried the whole thing, pretty much the attitude I had. I started teaching back in DC. The art director at WTOP TV taught in an adult school class in drawing at night once a week, and he started working as an actor at night and couldn't teach the rest of the semester. So he asked if I would take over the class and mentioned how much money it was. And I became an enthusiastic instructor.
So you had some background before you were, you know, working later on at the university level.
Yeah, I taught high school kids for a summer, and I realized I was really more at the level of college age people, because wrestling the kids to the ground before they would listen to you was not my idea of a great way to spend time.
Have you did you, when you were animating, did you ever do any animations that were based on your own narratives, or was that all client work?
It was all client work. I did do a couple of personal shorts that were the basis for Sink, Tub, and Toilet that were going to appear on Oxygen, but that was the only one. Animation, it was so time consuming, even using computers, that I never wanted to do it in my little of spare time.
No, that makes perfect sense. One thing I want to ask too is when you were doing Pudge Girl Blimp, I'm wondering what kind of feedback you got, if any, from readers when that work was initially coming out.
Well, initially, when I went to the San Diego con and was selling the Pudge at Ron Turner's Last Gasp Echo Funnies booth, I was constantly approached by teenage boys. They were totally enthusiastic about the book, wanted to buy more, etc. And talking with them, I realized that they identified with Pudge because they also were pretty clueless and wanted to be hip and wanted to be in, but couldn't manage it.
Yeah.
And I assumed that was because at that time, most of the readers of comics and comics were for everyone.
One of the things I mean, the comic is called Pudge Girl Blimp, and it's got this kind of, the way you narrate it is very interesting because it's almost a little bit like, it's not exactly like Crypt Keeper level irony or anything, but the narrative voice kind of gently sort of makes fun of Pudge a little bit. But I always kind of read it too as a sort of externalization of self-criticism that you were very familiar with. I mean, or at least that's how I kind of read it. Like, did you feel that that character expressed your own like social anxieties or body image issues at the time you were drawing it?
Not at all. I originally thought that because I had worked in comic strips and uh, really knew if you wanted to do a continuing character, that it was best to base it on yourself in order to not have to stretch your imagination. And so I started kid who was alienated because of being a snob, actually. But what kept coming out was this really round, jolly kid. And so I finally gave up and decided that was who she should be.
That's so interesting. So it was really like a creative emergence of a different personality rather than just like
Yeah,
some thinly veiled Binky Brown avatar of yourself.
right, right. All
But
the
yeah, I mean, in a way,
stories
she's
in the
almost like
Pudge
this
book,
Candide figure, she's just like,
yes,
she wants it. She wants to enter this world, but she just kind of shows up, and then a lot of things are happening around her, and also too I think, what you were saying about the teenage boys, like, I mean, my recollection is the introduction of the comic is that like, she's there, she's kind of very open to everything, but she also does have this secret. She's ashamed that she's still a virgin and she's trying to lose the virginity, but without revealing that vulnerability, just wanting to sort of walk into the room and seem like she's hip and with it and ready to go and wait for some guy to just kind of go like, oh yeah, let's go back to my crash pad or something like that, but it doesn't quite work out that way.
well, all the stories are things that my friends were telling me or that I experienced myself. Um, my Macy's experience, she had also being paid a dinky amount in comparison to the Jews. So quite a few people have mentioned that this is a story of that time, a story of the 70s. And I can say that that's perfectly true because all the stories really actually happened, only slightly altered to
Yeah.
happen to her.
Well, yeah, and that goes back to I think one Margaret's one of Margaret's ideas, which is that not only are these comics in what we might think of as the archive of feminist countercultural literature, but they are an archive of experiences, even if they're fictionalized or exaggerated or satirized or something like that. Did you, I know you were part of the women's comics collective. Did you feel outside of that like you were particularly connected to the underground comic scene broadly, or did it feel kind of like you were sort of an inside women's comics, but an outsider the rest of the time?
Hmm. Well, I've always thought of myself as an outsider, commentator, The only time I really felt an integral part of a group and actively a group was with the Women's Comics Collective. And that was because of our common goals and the ambition that we had.
Great. Does anyone else want to take the opportunity to ask a question now? As I said, we're getting some, oh, here we go. Brandy's written a question here in the chat. Brandy, do you want to read this, or would you like me to read this out loud?
I guess I can read it. Hi, Aunt Lee.
Hey.
But when doing storyboards, did the directors at the time like give immediate feedback or directions on when they wanted things like master shots or close-ups, or were you given a lot of freedom to interpret, since most scripts don't really give camera direction?
I was allowed to do whatever I visualized. This was mostly with, so usually the director of photography and I would work out whatever was going down. And then the director kind of went along with us. There were a few exceptions to that, but that was usually the way it went. It was really quite wonderful to watch some of these movies and to see what I visualize now with actual people walking around, leaping around, doing what
This is a very broad question and maybe just not one that a person can answer, but I'm really just impressed, Lee, with your kind of pragmatic adaptability to different changing circumstances. And I know that some of that's just survival instinct, but is there anything in your background that you feel prepared you to be that adaptable? And again, I know that's a super broad question, but any, I don't know, maybe it's just your temperament, or just growing up, did you maybe have like a family member who had to do different kinds of work to keep going, that sort of was a model for you in any way?
I would say managing to survive my dad was the basis for all the flexibility and such. He was a dominant personality.
Enough said, enough said. Yeah. Well, I mean, at least you got a positive lesson out of that.
Yes, yeah. Hey, one of the things I regret was I never found a mentor at all. Tex Blaisdell gave me a start, but he had a lot of personal problems that there wasn't any. So making it up as I went along really enabled me to expand my imagination. But it was all based on survival.
Yeah. Well, and in a way too, I mean, going back to that question of, like what makes a person a good teacher, or what makes you, kind of having, even in this talk, you've got there's a sort of educational structure to it. And I think when you say that you regret that you never had a mentor, clearly, part of what you've done, among the many things you've done in your career, is give people something that you didn't have. So I think that's really wonderful too, in addition to all of your achievements as an artist, and even that's coming through in this talk here tonight with your series of lessons. So I'll just put out one last call. Does anybody else have any other questions? Want to make it known in the chat or raise a hand? And I think everyone is just overwhelmed, and kind of their head is spinning at how many different roles you managed to fill, and how, I mean, the thing that I'm very impressed by, among other things, is that not only did you do all of these jobs, you seem to have just kind of sort of found ways to embrace all of them too. And you weren't just like, you know, literally working at some company and going like, I'd rather be drawing comic books or something like that. You know, it's like you found something to love about all those jobs. And that's really, I think, super valuable and something that I think another thing we can take away from this talk. So first, I'll just say next week at the symposium, our speaker is going to be Alex Berenger. Alex Berenger is a scholar who's written a book called Lost Literacies, Experiments in the 19th Century US Comic Strip. I did order this book and I've received it. And it is interesting. This person's really drilled deep into sort of 19th century comics that precede you know, the stories of, you know, the Yellow Kid and the Sunday newspaper comics that we're more familiar with. And with that, please join me in giving our, even if it's silent, a loud virtual round of applause to Lee Mars, who I'm so grateful to for sharing so much with us tonight. Thank you very much, Lee. I really, really appreciate it. Okay, and thank you everyone, and we'll see you all next week. Thanks again.